We got
So-
time for class now.
10,000 comedians out of work, and I get Shecky Thomas.
Right in front of you, no less.
All right, so 100 years later, we get another issue. It's like the never-ending battle of the early church. It sounds like an ongoing soap opera. It's a miniseries. So after the Sixth Ecumenical Council and the Third Council of Constantinople, we encounter a slightly different issue. This is one of those topics that raise questions as to whether or not it's exclusively a doctrinal matter or whether or not it is a matter of practice and devotion. And I'll explain why I say that in just a second. But the Seventh Ecumenical Council, or the Second Council of Nicaea, deals with primarily, but not exclusively, as all the councils dealt with, peripheral issues. But it deals primarily with the question of icons. And we're going to look today at the broad picture of how we got to this particular council. First, the council began as a recommendation from the Empress Irene. And it was in order to, quote, correct the iconoclast heretics. Irene, interestingly enough, was acting as the regent for the emperor at the time, Constantine VI, who was 9 years old.
Oh,
So ladies, whenever you hear feminists talk about the degradation of women throughout history, just point to the Roman Empire. Because women were as powerful in the Roman Empire as any man. Just ask Claudius. His wife tried to poison him 3 times. Anyway, Constantine VI was born in AD 771. He became emperor in 780. And his mother, seeing what was taking place in the landscape of the church, contacted the emperor and said, we need to have contacted the emperor, on behalf of the emperor, said we need to have a council to address this. And the Patriarch of Constantinople, Paul IV, who in and of himself is a kind of dubious character, because he kind of waffled back and forth between positions. First an iconoclast, then an iconodule, and then he abdicated his patriarchy altogether. But he was the one that agreed with Irene, and then finally they decided that they would speak to his successor, Tarsius, the emperor, the patriarch Tarsius, Tarasius. Now, Tarsius is an interesting character. And I'm going to mention this just as an aside because I found him fascinating. I'm going to read to you his brief little bio. First, he was a secular administrator. He wound up attaining the rank of senator. He eventually became the imperial secretary to the Emperor Constantine VI and Irene, his mother. So when the Patriarch Paul IV of Constantinople decided to retire to a monastery, let's put that in quotes, decided to retire to a monastery, he recommended Tarsius to be the next patriarch. Anybody see a problem with that?
He was never in orders to start with.
He wasn't an ordained minister. Now here's the thing. He became an ordained minister, and those of us that have gone through orders just love this. He was consecrated to the bishopric. He was consecrated to the patriarchy. December 25th, 1784. Less than a week after he was ordained a deacon.
That is a fast track. Needs a little more time.
So we hear people complaining about, well, this person got ordained in 6 months. This guy got ordained in 6 days. And he went from deacon to bishop.
Oh, gosh.
But anyway, so that was our good friend Tarsius. And he ruled for quite a while. The convocation of the council was announced by Pope Hadrian I in a letter of Constantine VI and his mother, he's not from Mississippi, and it was dated 29 August 784, and essentially they said, you need to send people, we need to have this discussion, we need to talk about this topic, all right? And Tarsius sent the same letter, and he sent it in a synodal message. In other words, this is an official proclamation that you need to appear both to the Pope in Rome and to the 3 Eastern Patriarchs. Okay? So, the interesting thing about the Second Council of Nicaea, as far as the practical aspects of it, is that it didn't begin in Nicaea. It began in Constantinople, which when you think about the fact that the patriarch who called it is from Constantinople, that makes sense. There was only one problem. Get a bunch of bishops together and legates who disagree on a doctrinal issue back in this time period, and what do you get? You get a brawl. And the Iconoclasts did not like the fact that it was called, that first of all, a council was called, and secondly, that it was called in Constantinople, and they disrupted everything. So it was shut down, and a few months later it was moved to Nicaea, and it became the Second Council of Nicaea. Now, the decrees of the council itself were framed and written by Tarsius. They were ratified by the acclamation, subscriptions from all 350 bishops, not one dissenting bishop. That should tell you something about the council itself. Unanimous proclamation and pronouncement that the worship of images is, and I quote, agreeable to Scripture and reason, to the fathers and the councils of the church. However, in their proclamation, they made it clear, or maybe a better way of phrasing it was saying they were cautious, and they said that worship was to be relative or direct. And what they mean by that is whether the Godhead in the figure of Christ to be entitled to receive the same type of worship and adoration as the image itself. So they were very circumspect about that. All right? Now, there were a number of historians that had a problem with this being identified as an ecumenical council. The difficulty is that when you look at the acumen displayed, the arguments employed, and the remarkable freedom from what was alleged to be superstition, it's hard to deny this to be an ecumenical council when you have legates from all over the place and then unanimously agreeing on a topic. That's very rare to see that, especially in the early church. One finds upon interacting with the record, the patriarch declaring that at that time venerable images worked. Note this. This is the decree of the council. Images to be venerated worked. No miracles. There isn't one Latin or Greek church today that would agree to that statement. Not one. So you have an early ecumenical council basically saying, you have here a practice that in and of itself does not involve something miraculous. Okay? So, take a step back and look at two elements of the council. First, let's justify its ecumenical status. I'll just do that in some bullet points so you don't have to worry about it. And then we'll talk about what they actually discussed, okay? So, in order to truly appreciate that it is an ecumenical status, we need to understand that, number one, it was called by the Roman emperors to be an ecumenical council. All right? Roman emperors obviously talking about, well, at this point we're probably moving into it being defined as the Byzantine Empire, but the East. It was also endorsed by the Papal States. Now, even though we know that the western section of the Roman Empire fell because Rome fell, the Papal States, which covered a large swath of western Italy and southeastern Italy, were controlled by the church. So there was a deference by the invading armies, even though they were all Arian, but there was still deference to Roman religion, and Roman religion joined in the participation of this particular council. So it was empire-wide respected. It was called with the approval of the Pope, as I just mentioned. Unlike the First Council of Constantinople, if you'll remember, there was some question as to its ecumenical status. And specifically, two papal legates were present at its deliberations and signed the final decrees. 3, the Patriarch of Constantinople was present in person, unlike the last one, if you'll remember. He was in and out. He had to fight the Muslims. Other patriarchs were represented, and again, although on account of the Muslim incursion, some of them had to leave to go fight battles, but they sent their procurators to be a part of it. So all elements of the church were continually represented in this council. As I mentioned, the decrees were adopted by unanimous decision. I can't emphasize how significant that is. By unanimous decision of all 350 bishops. They were immediately received in all 4 Eastern patriarchies. They were immediately accepted by the Pope. And for a full 1,000 years, they had been received by the Latin and Greek churches. Okay? I'm going to read something to you from the 16th century in reference to the question of the ecumenical status of the Seventh Ecumenical Council, or Second Nicaea. Queen Elizabeth herself, the Protestant queen, appointed one of her most learned clergymen, the Protestant chaplain Richard Field, to examine all of the early councils. And in his Book of the Church, I'm paraphrasing not to go into the long excursus that he gives, but he says, this was his assessment of the ecumenical nature of the Second Council of Nicaea. Though not of a doctrinal nature, that was his assessment, the Seventh Council, called Second Nicaea, called of matters of manners, the Seventh General, and when you read in that time period, 15, 16, 1700s, when you read them say General Council, they mean Ecumenical Council. The Seventh General Council was called to determine matters of faith and manners, All the rest, note this, he's saying that every council post the Second Council of Nicaea, every council after the Seventh Ecumenical Councils were broken. Though our adversaries, who's he talking about? Though the Roman Catholic Church considered them general councils and rejected not only by us, so this is an Anglican cleric saying not only did we reject this, but the Grecians also rejected it as not a general ecumenical, but patriarchal or local council. This is a Protestant clergyman at the height of the Reformation, in the midst of the battles with Rome, analyzing the Seventh Ecumenical Council and saying it is legitimately an ecumenical council, which means what? Its decisions are to be adhered to by the church, by the whole of Christendom. And that everything after this is bunk. This is what he's arguing. All right? So, that's the demonstration.
Is it bunk in that
They're not
they
ecumenical.
were just not ecumenical councils?
They're
but
just
they
not
were-
ecumenical.
Were they discussing bad things and coming to bad decisions, or
No.
was it bunk because
No,
they just didn't
it
have
was,
people?
his resolution was determined exclusively on whether or not they can be considered a universal ecumenical worldwide gathering of clergy. And they said, and obviously
Okay.
the decision was no, they are simply local issues being dealt with by local clerics to resolve those local problems. All right, so the ecumenicity of the council's fairly established. Well, what did they determine? What was the conciliar declaration? Well, the council decreed that we're going to need at this moment to strap in our brains, because we're going back to the same pattern that we had in Nicaea leading up to Chalcedon with the interaction with language. Okay? So you need to strap in, take a deep breath, because we're going to be dealing with terms, because that's what all of this revolves around. How we understand what the terms being used mean. So, the council decreed that similar veneration, from the Latin venare, to honor, and honor should be paid to representations, note that word, representations, of the Lord and of the saints, as was accustomed to be paid to the Laurata tablets, representing Christian emperors, so that they should be, and here's where people are going to swallow their tongues, bowed to, saluted with kisses, attended with lights, candles, and the offering of incense. Okay? Now keep this in mind. This is a pattern of behavior, an expression of devotion, not implying or asserting that by these actions a miracle will take place. Keep this in mind, because this is where the problem derives, what happens after. Okay? The council was most explicit in declaring that this was, and this is the language, merely a veneration of honor and affection, such as can be given to the creature, and that under no circumstances could the adoration of divine worship be given to them but to God alone. Okay? So, the council has set the boundaries. This is what is going to happen. This is what is taking place. Affection, devotion, adoration, but you are not worshiping this particular image. And I'm emphasizing that because it goes sideways fast. Okay? So, latria, and we get into latria and dulia, and we get into all of these terms, and we'll hit them in just a second. Or worship, and here's where we start getting fungible, usually is contrasted with dulia, reverence, or veneration. Now this changes. In medieval theology, the distinction was made between latria, worship due to God and Christ as the Son of God, and dulia, due to the saints. Now here's something that most people don't know because of where we are today, and that is even the Virgin Mary, exalted above all the saints as the Theotokos, as the Mother of God, is not worthy of latria. Or in other words, she is not worthy to be worshipped as the Father, Son, or Spirit. Now you see why I say things go sideways rather quickly. Okay? After Albert Magnus, Albert the Great, it was customary to distinguish, and here we start with the philosopher's hamster wheel. We start with the high veneration, or hyperdulia, of Mary, from the dulia designated for the saints. Okay, so what have we said? We have said that Mary obviously holds a position of greater esteem than all of the saints, right? Right? Yes, the Theotokos. However, she is not worthy to receive the same worship that the Father, the Son, and the Spirit receive, right? Well, I don't like that. Mary's special. Mary needs another category. So what we're going to do is we're going to create this tertium quid, and we're going to create this third category, this hyperdulia, which is really way above the dulia that the saints get, not quite the latria that God gets. So let's just take the building blocks and start to elevate the position until we get to Rome declaring Mary as the co-mediatrix of the universe. The incremental movement is before us. Okay? Since the veneration of saints and of Mary was denied, we had to do something. We had to do something with the position of Mary. Now, we all know that in Protestantism, all there is latria. Dulia has been chucked to the curb. Everything is determined to be worship. And this is why post-Elizabeth and post-Richard Field, the Reformation moved away from the Seventh Ecumenical Council and determined that any involvement with icons is a violation of the prohibition to apply latria only to God. This is one of my issues with the Reformation. It always seems to have a knee-jerk reaction and go to an extreme. much as they tried to get rid of episcopacy. Anyway. Christ is worthy of worship, but the basis of that worship or adoration is his divine nature, and this is what Protestants are arguing. Now, I want you to pay attention to this, because this should start sending off bells in your thinking. Christ is worthy of worship, but on the basis of that worship or adoration is his divine nature. Prayer is not offered to the human nature of Christ. What does that sound like?
Nestorianism.
Uh-huh.
How do you separate the human from the divine? Okay, so this is a problem that now arises out of the Reformation. All right? So, we have the wrong whiteboard. We have the terms. Okay?
Very good.
I've done this once or twice. So we have, anybody know who Timothy was?
Sure.
Timao. That's what his name means. Timothy means to honor. There's also aspazomai. That means, it's hyperliterally it means to salute, but the object is to recognize or have deference. Okay? And then of course we have deleo, which dulia, to serve. Right? And then we have, of course, the word from Colossians and Hebrews, icon, right? Image, exact representation. And then we have, me breaking the whiteboard, we have latereo. These are the verb forms. When you see the W at the end, it's the, well, and that's a middle passive, not that you care, that's the only noun there. These are all verbs. Notice to, all right? And latria is to adore. Now here's the problem. If you were listening to me, the way that the council described latria was what? Worship. But notice, the council uses the term proskuneo, but it uses it to mean venerate. Now, if you remember way back when I was talking about worship within an Anglican context, and I talked about the Hebrew and the Greek concepts, what was the word that I told you meant worship? Proskuneo. This word and the use of this word created quite a disturbance when it was applied in the council. Since it was designated as the expression of worshiping God, because if you'll remember, we talked about this, it meant to bow, to prostrate yourself, to get down on your knees, on your face. The woman who had the issue of blood crawling through the mud reached up and grabbed the hem of Jesus' tunic. They grabbed the little bells that they had, not bells,
Fringe.
fringe, thank you. Little fringe at the bottom of his tunic. The word that they used was, she was worshiping him. So you can see that this created some sort of concern. And that's one of the reasons when we talk about latureo usually today now means to venerate. Adoration is fine, because veneration can be a synonym of adoration. But it does not carry the same meaning as proskuneo. But veneration has been identified as a synonym in most of the objections to interacting with icons, latereo has been identified as veneration has been identified as a synonym to worship. And this is why contemporary iconoclasts balk, especially Protestants, balk at the use of the word veneration. Because for them, that's a synonymous term to worship. You can't do that with an icon. You can't, yeah.
Well, so it seems to me that you don't even need to necessarily conflate these terms, though, for it to possibly be problematic. Because if you look at the Septuagint translation of the second commandment, right? It uses both. It uses latreo and proskuneo. So it says not to do either, basically.
Right. And we're gonna get into that, and what happens with the language. The standard argument, and I've heard this for the better part of 40 years. The standard argument is this. You know what? Let me give you an illustration. There was a construction company, and they were hired to transport truckloads of dynamite on a road that was 24 inches wide up a steep curving mountain for many miles. And the owner of the company called in all of these expert drivers to determine who he wanted to hire on this very, very dangerous, critical mission. So the first guy comes in and he lays out his 24 inches, curvy, blah, blah, blah. How would you negotiate this road? He goes, I can get to within 2 inches of the side of that cliff. Thank you very much. Get to the next guy. I can get to within 1.5 inches of that one. He goes, okay, thank you very much. He calls the third guy. He goes, and how would you negotiate it? He goes, I would stay as far away from the edge of that cliff as I possibly could. You're hired. Now, why do I say that? Because this is the argument that's used in reference to this practice. We have all of these terms. They mean all of these things. But they can lead to abuse. So let us take the most conservative position and remove ourselves from the most extreme understanding so we protect the practice of worshiping God and Him only. Now that's how one of the arguments is phrased. I'll let you determine whether or not there's validity in the argument, but that's the concern. The concern is that the language is of such a nature that it can create this problem. All right? Now, let us look at how this all began. We think, generally speaking, that the... Does anybody still need to copy that? No? Okay. We think that, generally speaking, when these issues crop up, they crop up right at that moment. No, we need to address this right now because this issue had been going on since the 100s. And I'm going to show you what incremental change looks like and why it becomes a problem if we're not careful. So in the late 2nd century, images of the Madonna, Mary, and Jesus start to crop up. And Christian artists start to adapt the Greco-Roman portrait style. Okay? Then the early 3rd century, and we start to see the clear extent of icons and the appearance of Christ and the saints in iconography in the catacombs. We see the symbolic imagery, fish, lamb, and of course our peacock friend, doves, conveying now theological meaning. All right, so we move from representation, artistic representation, and a lot of this revolves around the martyr cult. And I don't use cult, I'm not using cult in its negative term, I'm using cult as in an ethos, okay? A lot of this revolves around the martyr cult. Brother Adonias went to the Colosseum and gave this glorious testimony for Jesus before he was martyred. Let us remember, brother. So what do? You make a picture. And now we have a picture of our brother. Now I want you to just take that one concept that I used in reference to that, and now extrapolate as you keep going and you get to the Crusades, where now we have Christians going off to fight the good fight against the Muslim infidels, to take back the holy city, to rescue those people that are being murdered by the Muslims. So you can see just in that, and I'm not going to go into the martyr cult because there are like 5 different stages that we get to that last point. But you can see there is a desire to remember our fallen brethren. We do the same thing today. We have memorial gardens. We have plaques. Do the same thing. Okay? But here they start to develop theological meaning. Now we get into the 4th century, where icons proliferate post Constantine. Remember what Emperor Constantine did? Had his conversion experience at the Milvian Bridge, and now, okay, Christianity is the state religion, and by the way, all you Roman patricians give up your houses and make them churches. Well, now, icons start appearing everywhere, and churches begin to display images publicly, whereas before, they were in the catacombs. Now, Brother Adonias comes out of the catacombs, and now he's in the church. And we're not only respecting them and honoring them in burial contexts, now we're experiencing them on a weekly basis. And then, of course, there's the 5th and the 6th centuries, and this is where it comes to a head, and we're going to get to him in just a second, where we have fully developed iconographic tradition, and we see it emerging at this time. And the earliest surviving copy of the Christ Pantocrator from the 500s. Take a look at it. That's the 5th century. The one on the back is Botticelli's version of the mother and the child. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about iconographic images making their prominence known by 500 AD. All right? So it's no longer limited to liturgy, prayers in remembrance of our fallen. Now notice that. It's prayers in remembrance of our fallen brethren that eventually become what?
Please help me.
Prayers for the dead of our fallen. See, now do you see how the transition starts to work? That, I don't know who said it, but Christianity is the epitome of the road to hell is lined with good intentions. Every single thing that we've just discussed was noble. It was honorable. It was done out of affection and love and grace. And it got abused. And it got abused fast. Right? Okay, so where does all of this get its real impetus? gets its real impetus from Porky over here. Pseudo-Dionysius. The only unfortunate thing is we really have no definitive date as to his birth or death. We just know that he was between the late 400s and the early 500s AD. Now, why is he so significant? He created, and this is I say this as a philosopher, he does what every philosopher does. He keeps himself employed. Because he creates a system that both sides adopted. The Iconoclasts adopted some of his system, and the Iconoclasts adopted some of his system. This is what he presents, and he presents much more. But these are the four main positions that he advocated. He advocated for apophatic theology. Okay? Now, if you'll remember, way back, I talked about St. Augustine and how St. Augustine dealt with theology when he was talking about the character of God, the attributes and nature of God, and he did it via negativa, right? God is not X. That was the way that we could understand, because we can't affirmatively say that God is love because we don't know what love is in its purest form in the Godhead. We know what it derivatively looks like, the death of Christ, but we don't know what the nature of God means when it uses the term love. So we define it in the negative, and that's what apophatic theology means, that God cannot be depicted. Important point. You can't create an image of God. All right? The second is the symbolic mediation, that the material symbols reveal divine realities. Note that. Reveal divine realities. So you're not simply looking at an image of That image is communicating something transcendent. Transcendent. Going through puberty at 70. Okay? Then he creates then he argued for a hierarchy, and that is that creation is a ladder. It is a system of symbols leading upward to God. So the material icons of Jesus are just one material stepping stone in order to reach the divine. And then right on the heels of that is theurgy. Comes from two Greek words which mean theos and erg, or ergon, which is work, the work of God. This is, without a doubt, the most controversial and difficult concepts because of how it winds up being applied. Now, I gave the most benign definition here. Liturgical rites use material objects to convey, and there's the problem, divine grace. So, we bring this to church, we construct liturgical rites around this image, and by doing that, we are now receiving divine grace through that action. And this is where people go high and to the right. And it also develops even further problematic issues because in its broadest sense, the idea is designed to invoke or to persuade the presence of deities to act upon the material world, to elevate the human soul. This is used in the secular arena as a term applied to magic. And this is why this particular term became incredibly volatile and divisive. Because we're talking about doing things materially that provoke God to respond a certain way. You're manipulating God. Now, if you take a half a step back, and you go sit down on your couch, and you turn on TBN, and you listen to any of the televangelists, they do the same thing. It is a form. It comes out of Neoplatonism, and it is a form of animism, where you take the material world, you assign it to have life, and then by that you can speak things into existence. You can control the spirits by your word. Just listen to it. Go to TBN. I don't even know if they still exist. But
They do.
Oh,
okay,
yeah.
just
Oh,
go listen
sure.
to that. I told you this joke. I sat down with my roommate.
Yeah.
How long? 13 seconds. 13 seconds. How long does it take the first heresy to pop up? 13 seconds. We fell off the couch. We couldn't stop laughing. This is what, and this is essentially where it comes from. Now, the church early on attempted to sanctify the term. The difficulty is it's so heavily laden with Neoplatonic and secular meaning that it just became a problem. Okay? So, here we have all of Mr. Pseudo-Dionysius. Now, let's look at this. Is really fun. All right? So, the iconoclasts, those who were opposed to the use of icons, jumped all over that. They jumped all over apophatic theology. He's beyond all images. Then why are you trying to paint pictures of him? Leave it alone. All right? Non-representational symbols, right, point 2, these are appropriate. Abstract symbols such as the cross, the gospel book, right, and the Eucharist are appropriate. Why? Any idea? Yeah, well, because they're direct expressions of what Christian theology teaches. But all of these symbols are separate. This is the iconoclastic argument. All of these symbols are separate from pictures or images that are created. Okay? A picture or image that is created. What's the problem with this picture? Just look at the picture. It should jump off the page at you.
Holy the book.
Huh?
Holy the book.
Anybody else got an idea?
Well, we don't really know
Know what?
he looks like.
That's it. That's why pictures and images are problematic. Nobody knew what Jesus. Let's put it this way. Scripture does not give a specific definition as to what his appearance was. Now, you get all of the extrapolating arguments. Yes, but these images are created by people who saw and knew Jesus naked, describe what he looked. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Cross, gospel, Eucharist, definitively deriving from Christian theology. Pictures, man-made, problematic. All right? The iconoclasts said that true worship, and this is what kind of gets stuck in my throat, true worship is intellectual, not material. See, everybody just goes one step too far. You know, can't just leave it alone. You gotta push that boundary. So they claimed that Dionysius, by the way, the argument is that he was in somehow connected to the Areopagite that's mentioned in Acts. This is what the tradition is. Go back and read Acts, you'll see what I'm talking about. But they claim that Dionysius teaches that the soul must ascend beyond material things. What does that sound like? Intellectual ascension beyond the material. What does that sound like?
Gnosticism.
There we go.
There you go.
Okay? So, according to the iconoclasts, all of this iconic imagery detracts from true worship. Okay? And all of this is discussed in their polemics against the iconoclasts. But wait, there's more. The iconodules. So now we got the guys in favor of the use of icons. And they particulate, and we're going to get to him next week, but there is a church father that literally taps into what Pseudo-Dionysius wrote, John of Damascene. And we'll get into him and how important, and he is really important. But according to the iconodules, material symbols, and this is where you get into problems, mediate God to reveal himself. Icons are precisely such symbols. In other words, according to that view, if I kneel, bow, pray, kiss, salute, light candles and burn incense, and earnestly pray and devote myself
Yeah.
to the attention of this icon will be and here's the word that you're going to hear in just a minute, a window to God. Okay? This is what the iconodules argue. The incarnation, and you will hear this all the time, and I'm going to say this is one of those two-edged swords. Because on the one hand, nobody does a better job of understanding the importance and the significance of the incarnation in Christianity than does the East. The West has dropped the ball, not on the belief in the incarnation, but on the emphasis of the incarnation for that very reason. Because they don't want to be identified with the East. That's what it is. And they don't want to be identified with the implication of what we are about to discuss based upon the incarnation. And this comes through John of Damascene, and we'll get to him in more detail last week. Listen to the way the argument is stated. If God became visible in Christ, if God manifests himself, becomes visible, according to the Gospel of John, we saw, touched, heard, ate with him. If God becomes visible in Christ, then depicting him affirms the incarnation. And just ponder that for a minute. Affirms the incarnation. Any concerns with what that says? You don't have to answer it now. We'll get to it next week. I'm just going to throw that out for you to think about it this week. What does it mean when we say that some sort of icon or symbology or iconography affirms the incarnation? What does that mean? Also, Dionysius' symbolic theology supports this, that the visible reveals the invisible. The incarnation reveals the invisible, immutable God, right? And then they affirm the hierarchy. This becomes a real driving force. The church's liturgy uses material things. Do we not? Do we not use holy water? Just water in general. Do we not use oil every Sunday when I anoint you? Do we not use bread? And I sound like the Merchant of Venice. Do we not bleed? do we not have vestments? We know that they had vestments. So, according to what the iconodules derive from Dionysius, icons belong to this hierarchical, symbolic order. Okay? And then we get into liturgy. Liturgy sanctifies matter. Liturgy sanctifies matter. And the concern with that is this. What do we mean when we use the term sanctify? The term sanctify can be used in a number of different ways. This church was sanctified, right? Set apart for spiritual usage to worship and honor God. But we also know that sanctification has a very distinct metaphysical meaning. Are you mortifying your flesh? I sure shoot and hope you are. Well, that's sanctification, and that's metaphysical, my friends. That's the Holy Spirit acting on you. So what are we talking about when we talk about liturgy sanctifying matter? I'm throwing it out. We'll get to it later, but I'm throwing it out to give you the sense of the tension that's now going to start arising. Icons are a part of the liturgical environment, according to Dionysius, and therefore, because they are a part of the liturgical environment, they become symbols and means of access. You ever wonder why this is down here and not upstairs? There's a reason that this is down here and not upstairs. There's actually a reason. It's not just, oh, well, it fits here better than up there. You ever notice when we don't have icons on the altar? Think about that. There's a reason that we don't have icons on the altar. We have an icon, so obviously we're not militantly opposed to icons, but you don't see them upstairs. And that's just a tidbit as to the difference between East and West, which we'll get into next week as well. Okay? So, I'm going to sum up pseudo here with this. This becomes foundational, not only for this particular council, but this battle, if you will, becomes foundational for the development of Byzantine theology moving forward throughout church history. Okay? Questions?